Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Annie Bowers. I'm a visiting scholar at FREOPP, focusing on higher education. I'm very lucky to be joined here today with Preston Cooper, who's a senior fellow at FREOPP, who you probably saw earlier in one of the panels in the large room. We also have Audrey Mickahail, who is Vice President for Delivery at Opportunity at Work. So I'm excited to hear about lots of your experiences. And we have Michael Hunter, who is Chief of Staff in the Arizona House of Representatives. So we have a great panel here today to talk about a very provocative question: is higher education obsolete? I think we all know that a lot of young people today and anyone looking to learn today has a lot of options available. You know, you can go on YouTube and search just about anything you want to learn and watch a video. So it's a real question, you know, what is the value that higher education brings to us nowadays? Some of the, components of the value of education are accessibility, both in forms of affordability and just, alternatives to the traditional four-year bachelor's degree. So I thought maybe we could start off with Preston just sharing a little bit about some of the indicators of, some of the quality indicators that we see that kind of speak to what the value is of higher education today, if it's declining in some respects or increasing in some respects. Yes, love to hear your thoughts on that.
Thanks very much, Annie. So I apologize. I'll repeat myself a little bit from the prior session. But if you go onto the Bureau of Labor Statistics website, there's a page called Education Pays, and you can see what is the average, wage associated with each level of education. And so you can see that, the average wage for people with a four-year college degree is up here, and the average wage for people with only a high school diploma is down here. So we look at this raw gap and we say, oh, great, college must pay off for everybody. Let's just send everybody to college, and everybody can get a 65% increase in their earnings. Unfortunately, it doesn't work out that way in the real world all the time. College definitely is worth it for a lot of people, but we find that sometimes if college is too expensive, students are not necessarily earning enough earning enough more over their counterfactual selves over a typical high school graduate to earn back the cost of tuition and the lost wages that they might have incurred when they were out of the labor force. If they choose a field of study that might not have a whole lot of labor market relevance, sometimes they won't be earning that average. They'll be earning well below that average and may not necessarily be earning back the cost of their education. And then we also see that almost 40% of students who start college do not finish. And these folks sometimes will take on some student debt. They'll be in college for a semester or two or three, but they won't get the degree, and they won't get most of the earnings benefits that come with that degree. And so we end up seeing that while college does pay off for many people, it does not for many others. That return on investment is positive. So for about 72% of bachelor's degree programs, 72% of programs, you can expect to be better off for having enrolled, but 28%, the ROI is negative. You are probably going to be worse off for having enrolled in that program. And so rather than necessarily saying, setting up as a binary, like is college worth it, is college not worth it, we should be looking at when college is paying off, for what kinds of fields of study, what kinds of institutions, what kinds of students, and then making sure that we can kind of expand upon the areas where higher education is working out, and for the areas where higher education is not working out, either try to fix it or maybe start to provide alternatives that might work out better for some students.
Audrey, I'd love to hear about some of the individuals that you work with in your STARS program, which is Skilled Through Alternative Routes, and what have been some of the drivers for those individuals who are looking for further training? Why are they not opting for the traditional bachelor's degree and instead looking towards some of these alternatives?
Yeah. Thank you, Annie. So I work for an organization that we do a lot of research, and my role specifically is working with employers to encourage them to understand the math problem that we have when we look at the labor market. So, there are 140 million American workers that are active in the labor force right now. 70 million of them are skilled through alternative routes, meaning they have skills, they're over the age of 25, they've been active in the labor market, but they don't have that bachelor's degree. And so when we think about working directly with organizations to try and get them to fulfill their needs, like their open roles, because we know that on the employer side, it's a persistent challenge to get them to recognize the gaps that they perceive, and some people will call that a skill gap. We actually see that far more often it is an opportunity gap. It is self-inflicted wounds that employers place on themselves. So let me give you a couple of examples of some of those alternative routes that we see, and particularly because it's November, I'm thinking a lot about Veterans Day, which is coming up on Friday, and about National Apprenticeship Week, which is next week. So those are just two of the alternative routes that we think about. Others are community college or shorter term credentials, or frankly, the way most of us, I think, have learned the skills that we deploy every day, which is by showing up to work and doing the things. And whenever we ask that question, I spared you all the show of hands exercise today, but we've asked that question in room after room, in audience after audience, and invariably, most of the people in the room, when we ask them, where did you learn the skills that you deploy in your day-to-day jobs, they don't answer that they learned them in college. It's not to say that college, again, doesn't have value. It certainly does, and it is a reliable way to a middle or high wage job. But let's talk about some of the other ways that are also available to folks. So I mentioned military service as an alternative pathway, and we see that individuals who've gone through military service can gain tremendous skills. And I want to talk a little bit about, very briefly, because there's a lot we can say about this, one employer that we worked with, unsurprisingly, well, there's a surprise and a not so surprising thing. So the particular employer I want to mention is called HII. They're a defense contractor, multi-billion-dollar company. They operate throughout the country, and their major client is the Navy. The surprising thing about working with the Navy is the Navy actually makes it, or the federal government makes it a little bit hard to hire, wait for it, veterans. Why? Because almost every RFP that the federal government puts out for a defense contract has certain requirements around bachelor's degrees that makes it really difficult to bring veterans into those pathways. So HII has a VP of talent acquisition named Nicole Goldman, and she's an incredibly energetic leader. I'm totally inspired every time I talk to her. And her philosophy, very briefly, is we do a lot of things. We try a lot of things. But let me tell you about just one of the things that they tried. They recognized that they had a hard-to-fill role. And if there's one thing I can tell you about working effectively with employers, it's that it's important that we start from the business need. Unsurprisingly, it's important that there is a WIFM, what's in it for me. And the WIFM for HII was that they had a particular role that they were really struggling to fill. The time to fill was increasing, the number of candidates was decreasing. This was during the pandemic, and they were finding that individuals who had security clearances were increasingly leaving the job market. So what they ended up doing was working with their client at the Navy and trying to gauge his receptivity, this particular individual, to opening up the RFP process to individuals, to creating a new labor category, individuals without bachelor's degrees. And to kind of fast forward a little bit, part of what enabled them to do that was, one, they had observed that they had a real need. Like I said, they were seeing in their data that it was harder and harder to fill this high-need role, intelligence analyst. Two, they had a receptive client who was willing to negotiate with them. Three, they observed that the individuals who were in that role came from who were successful intelligence analysts, and this isn't a key point, came from a wide variety of backgrounds. Can you learn some of the skills like problem solving and critical thinking and pattern recognition? As an art history major, yeah, you can. Can you also learn by being in the military those same skills? Yeah, you can. And so once you found an individual who was willing to work with and negotiate with a key partner on the other side and had data to back up that there was a real need and the juice, so to speak, was worth the squeeze, they were able to open up that pathway to veterans. And with a relatively short training program to on-ramp Navy vets into this program, those vets were, by the way, able to almost immediately double their salaries. So that was another nice byproduct. So that's example one, military service as an alternative pathway. The second one I want to talk about, and I'll be really brief here, is apprenticeship. We have about 50,000 apprenticeships a year in the United States. It's not a very large number when we consider the size of the overall American labor market. If we were to have the same proportion, and this is in research that's about to come out next week from Burning Glass Institute and Multiverse, if we were to have the same proportion of apprenticeships in the United States that, say, the United Kingdom has, that number would be well over 800,000 a year. So all of this to say, there's a lot of excitement around apprenticeship right now. It's not a overutilized, shall we say, route. But there is some really exciting opportunities in apprenticeship, and it's not just in the trades. Typically, when we think about apprenticeship, we think about the Main Street economy. We think about trades, electricians, HVAC. In fact, one of the interesting developments is that we're starting to see apprenticeship pop up in whole new occupations. One that I just want to highlight, and there are many of them, but just one to highlight is Accenture has an apprenticeship program to recruit individuals into their early in career consulting roles. And they've been at this for a few years. But in 2022, they set a goal for themselves to hit 20% of their early in career recruitment through their apprenticeship program, and they hit that mark. And the reason I wanted to highlight Accenture in particular is because we all know that in the professional services world, that pedigree is really deeply entrenched. So I highlight Accenture because if a company that is as used to recruiting on campus as they are can do 20% of their early in career recruiting through an apprenticeship program, that gives me a lot of hope for the recognition of this particular alternative pathway.
Yeah, great. Yeah, it's exciting to hear about companies really adopting this apprenticeship model. I know that there are lots of, even if they don't call it an apprenticeship, lots of companies, net tech companies, et cetera, are training their employees as soon as they hire them, essentially, but through, a program that is a couple weeks long. And obviously it's usual to receive training on the job when you first arrive, but something in that style to really get those skills going. It's really encouraging to see.
Well, just one more point on that. One of the things I spent most of my career in the private sector advising, mostly IT executives, and the single biggest topic we ever talked about was talent shortages. And then they'd say, well, we want to hire these early in career folks. And they would show me job descriptions that were not early in career. They were people who really had quite a bit of skill. But what we're starting to see, and this is another thing that's going to come out in this new research, is that employers are starting to understand that to attract talent, training is one of the things they ought to be talking about in their job postings. So what Burning Glass Institute found was that there's a 6.4x increase in the number of employers who are explicitly calling out, if not apprenticeship explicitly, training as one of the value propositions of employment with their organizations. And I think that's really exciting.
Yeah, and I think this would be a nice segue to start discussing some of the state level policy that has helped make this possible for employers and as well as in state governments. Preston, as you mentioned earlier, we have a new report that came out discussing some of the state level reforms on higher ed. But I'd love to hear from you, Michael, about your experience in Arizona. I know there was some recent legislation concerning degree requirements in state jobs, or at least reviewing existing degree requirements. And I know you have other experience with higher ed as well. So.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to hang with you guys. I feel like I'm in the cafeteria with the cool kids right now. I had opportunities to hang out with more think tanky people, but my career has been primarily in sort of the practitioner trenches of government trying to implement sometimes the creative stuff that you all come up with. And so probably my story inevitably points to more of the obstacles than the successes. It's good to talk about the successes, but I think that there's, I worked on school choice for decades before I ended up staffing Speaker Ben Toma, who made it happen. Universal ESAs in Arizona is a big deal. Similarly, I've worked on higher education issues to sort of reform the funding formulas, the perspective on what we're subsidizing and not subsidizing and at what level. And the obstacles are often, we have 3 state universities in Arizona. Key people in key places had loyalty to one of those universities. It was their alma mater, it was where their children were going or something, that a lot of this stuff would just sort of hit the rocky shore and run aground. So I think, some of the examples, when I was staffing the Arizona Board of Regents, I was one of their senior people, and with an eye toward, my career has always been in and around state government and the legislature. And so figuring out how we can channel some of the energy to reform the funding formulas with an eye toward, once you've done that and you've got some understanding of what a baccalaureate degree in each of the certain areas costs, you could turn that into a voucher or some friendlier word for that to see where this money could go to follow students and their interests. And I think in the latter half of my career, I suppose, I've seen more and more older students, career-oriented, looking for something different than what they're going to get in the traditional school. STEM is always an exception. I mean, our public universities have really exceptional programs, and people come from all over the country and the world to attend some of our STEM programs. Engineering is a big deal at ASU, et cetera. And whenever I got bored at a Regents meeting, they might have a presentation from some exciting stuff on the lenses that are created to explore the universe from the University of Arizona. It's like, okay, I'm watching the Discovery Channel all of a sudden, and this is exciting stuff. So I think there's a lot that I would think about for the universities. But one thing that I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, because I've been mentioning it in a lot of other places lately. During my career and while I was in grad school, I focused a lot on political institutions and all these sort of institutions broadly understood. And if you haven't had a chance to read Yuval Levin's book that came out a few years ago now, but I guess it was the middle of COVID or middle of the impeachment or something, so I don't know how much attention it got, but A Time to Build, about institutions. I view Arizona's public universities as institutions that are in decline. The institutions, when they're at their best, are formative. A lot of our universities, a lot of what you pick up on publicly is more about performance. And the faculty members that are using the university as an institution, often very irresponsibly, for a personal platform or their own personal agenda. And I recognize, when I was working for the Regents, this was a while ago, I was talking to a recently retired big university president, who I won't name or name the institution, but it was a big one. And he was pointing to the academic freedom statements from 1940 and reminded me that while the academic freedom statement says basically hands off, we have tenure, we can say what we want, there was a third paragraph of that statement that was about personal responsibility, responsibility as a representative of that institution, and that what you say matters. It can reflect poorly on yourself, your discipline, your, how you say it. You better be accurate. And I realize the farther I go along in my career, I do specialize in generalizations. But there's a sense with a lot of the attention, and when I hear from parents who don't want to send their kids to a university, and especially with what's going on in recent, reflections of the news events that are going on, the people that are not wanting to fund it, not wanting to send their kids there, it's becoming an issue where I think if you're using the university as a platform, and when you have free speech zones at universities, it's a sort of different deterioration than I think we would have been expected. And so I think there's a time to turn that around through state policy, through our work to develop laws. If we're going to not have higher education become obsolete, we do need to recognize that there are people who want to subsidize alternatives to education, to higher education. That a degree in refrigeration school, as high tech as that is these days, it's a specialized area, and there's a discipline and a formation that goes along with it, the professional standards that go along with that. It's not a baccalaureate degree, no necessarily should it be, but it is a viable alternative. And if we're going to subsidize it with taxpayer dollars a degree in journalism, it's immoral that we don't do that on refrigeration, especially if you've ever been to Arizona in August. That seems sinful.
Can I add a little bit to that? Yeah, I think it's we can't have this conversation about college and apprenticeships without talking about the fact that the federal government creates a very uneven playing field with regard to funding for these options. So if I'm a student and I want to go to a traditional college, I can get up to $7,500 a year in Pell Grants. If I'm a low-income student, I can take up to $58,000 in total in student loans, $2,500 per year in tax credits. The universities themselves will get appropriations from the state government. They'll get tax exemptions for donations and for endowments. There's a lot of ways that we subsidize higher education. If I'm an employer and I want to start an apprenticeship, well, first I have to apply to be on the eligible training provider list, a list that each state maintains of approved, workforce training programs. Then I have to find a student who meets a long list of conditions, who might potentially qualify for apprenticeship funding, but the funding is going to be limited. There's a limited pool. It's not an entitlement, so the funding might not even be there. And if it is, it's probably going to be a couple $1,000s at most. So a lot of employers just look at this system and say, I'm not even going to bother. And that's one reason why, as Audrey mentioned, we have far fewer apprenticeships per capita than they do, say, in England or Germany or many other European countries. So I think, to kind of start this conversation, we need to talk about, making sure that playing field with regard to federal funding is level. And I'm not talking about necessarily like having student loans for apprenticeships or anything like that, because the models are different and student loans wouldn't make sense. But we should have come up with some sort of formula where if I'm a student and I want to go pursue an apprenticeship instead of a traditional college degree, there's some sort of formula that will provide funding for that option that is somewhat on par with the funding I would receive if I went the traditional college route.
On that note, Audrey or Michael, are there any federal reforms that off the top of your head, or state level reforms that would really be the most impactful, the most meaningful to supporting these alternative education routes, alternative training routes?
Do you want to start, Michael?
Well, I suppose one area that Audrey, I think, hit on in an Arizona specific case, if you've received training, credentialing, experience in certain areas, then you can qualify for licensure where there are licenses needed in Arizona. That's been freed up, and it's always a work in progress. But probably the best example that I'm familiar with is those who served in the military. I know my dad he learned about electronics in the Marine Corps in the early 60s. And the fact that he never had a bachelor's degree sort of haunted him. He never did get one. He got an associate's degree with his GI Bill that helped a little bit. But by the time he retired, he was a vice president of quality assurance for high reliability semiconductors. And so that was the pinnacle of his career. But I think he probably would tell you that if he had a bachelor's degree, it would have been very different. But it is an example of work experience that started with military experience. And I served in the military and know that there are people who spend a lot of time going to police school. I was in the military police. And so now a lot of that training is recognized. There are things that you still need to fill those gaps, but we're better at it in Arizona than we had been before. And you know, it is an open question. How many of these degrees where it's really time on task and experience, you get a special bump for getting a baccalaureate degree that has nothing to do with what you do, and then I think sometimes these degrees aren't as rigorous as they used to be. So it's just everybody's in this system to sort of check the box and get this police officer the promotion by getting him a degree in criminal justice or whatever else it is. You know, my dad's degree in that example was in history. He got an AA from the local community college in history. So I do think that there's a lot more we can do in those sectors. The military is a perfect example. And then just to hit the bell again, one thing that happens in the military, that it waxes and wanes over the years like it does with any institution. But for the most part, if you see a resume and the person that you're looking at in the resume has military experience or sport team experience or something where there's been a formation, it doesn't necessarily ring that their experience in college is going to be helpful for this being a good hire. It doesn't necessarily mean that. It used to mean that there's some signaling that you can accomplish something, you accomplish your degree. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you can read well, write well. You kind of have to go beyond that. But there's a sort of team player kind of thing, or an upstanding character. Of course, there are bad actors that emerge from the military, but for the most part, if you've got an honorable discharge, you understand the concept of conduct unbecoming. You know, there's a way that you behave, that an officer and a gentleman is a thing. We know what it looks like when you're not doing that. I remember when the tailhook scandal happened, and I got all kinds of training about what not to do. That's conduct unbecoming. That's not what officers and gentlemen do. So don't do that. That sort of formation that happens in the military or even in professional schools where they care a lot about people who are out in the industry that are bad actors. It's like, that's not a good thing, but you don't have that same dynamic, at least anymore, in a university setting.
I'll add a couple things. This is definitely not my area of expertise, so I want to be cautious here. So one of the big debates when we talk about apprenticeship is to register or not to register, to your point. We often contrast Accenture's non-registered apprenticeships. IBM also has lots of apprenticeships. They have chosen to go the registration route. So it would be great to see if that were, registration with the Department of Labor. So it holds. It would kill me to say that one is better than the other. It's just that one would give you recognition from the Department of Labor, and I don't know if you want to speak to this point specifically. So I'll hand you the mic in a second. But the other thing from a federal perspective that could be also helpful is something that you alluded to, which is kind of short-term Pell. Like, can we expand Pell grants to apply to credentials, not just degrees? So those are the two things that, though outside my area of expertise, that I hear people in the workforce space talk the most about, seem rather promising, and are the things that I'm hopeful about. Do you want to speak to that?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, apprenticeships are wonderful, but they do cost money up front for the employer to set up. I mean, you have to take a chance on somebody who might not necessarily have a whole lot of pre-existing skills. The point of the apprenticeship is to train them up with the skills they'll need to be successful in that job, but they don't necessarily have the skills at the outset. You might need to pay for classroom, experience. You might need to take classes at a local community college. You just have to come up with the infrastructure to run this training program for new hires, and a lot of this does take resources. And right now, as I mentioned before, the funding formulas for federal funding tend to privilege the traditional college degree route a lot more over the apprenticeship route. And so I would love to see things like, for instance, allowing students to use their Pell Grants to pay for the classroom components of apprenticeships, or expanding Pell Grants to short-term programs. Right now, there's a minimum of about 600 clock hours that for each program that's going to be eligible for Pell Grants. If we were to lower that and so allow more short-term training programs to access these federal funding streams, provided there's some quality assurance, some performance standards in there, I think that could be very helpful in terms of opening up some of these options that might be better for students, might work out better for workers in some cases, but which people aren't choosing right now because the federal government has its thumb on the scales in favor of the traditional college route.
Yeah, and I know you spoke about this a little bit earlier, Preston, but would you like to share again some of the state level reforms that might be helpful, encouraging these alternatives or allowing alternatives to come about more easily, things like that?
Absolutely. So, we're big fans of some of the stuff that Opportunity at Work has been working on in terms of having governors have been issuing executive orders to basically say, we want to remove bachelor's degree requirements from most jobs in the state executive branch, so that these positions can be open to the 62% of Americans who lack a bachelor's degree, but who may have relevant skills or experience that would enable them to succeed in that role. We're also fans of eliminating unnecessary degree requirements in occupational licenses, which I know is something Arizona's been thinking about a lot. If we're not saying that we want to get rid of all occupational licenses, but we do think that sometimes the degree requirements are duplicative of other requirements that are already in the license. New York, for instance, just passed a law requiring registered nurses to get a bachelor's degree, even though registered nurses in New York already had to have, a certain number of clinical hours. They had to have at least a two-year college degree. They had to pass the nursing exam, which is a long acronym, which escapes me. But the bachelor's degree requirement on top of all that other stuff is somewhat duplicative, and it probably does keep some people out of the profession at a time when we are staring down the barrel of what could be a nursing shortage. That's one thing that we are encouraging state governments to do, is to take a look at getting rid of those unnecessary degree requirements, both in the public and private sectors. We are also looking at some other reforms, such as tying state funding for universities to student outcomes, such as earnings or learning benchmarks, to make sure that universities have an incentive to prioritize those programs which are getting students into the labor force, which are equipping them with the skills that they need to get good jobs. And we're also looking at reforming state authorization requirements for new colleges. So right now, if you want to start a new college, you have to get permission from the state authorizer. And while this is an important consumer protection tool, it does sometimes have the effect of keeping innovative new providers who might be able to equip students with the skills they need at a low cost and potentially with more labor market relevance. It does have the effect of keeping some of those innovative new providers out of the market. So we're encouraging states to kind of take a look at their state authorization policies as well and see if they can make them a bit more friendly to innovation.
And Michael, I know that you have a good amount of experience working with Arizona on their higher education performance funding for the public universities and colleges there. Is there anything you can tell us about things that have worked well or not worked well in Arizona along those lines?
I think one example that I would cite is where we are working with certain communities, industries that need specialized training, or where there's a shortfall of applicants, et cetera. The Teachers Academy is one example where we've put money into subsidizing efforts to recruit and train teachers in Arizona. And I guess another example that I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up, because it's practical success in Arizona that hasn't been a big reform that's established, but a practice, and I wonder how much this is an example in other states, and if any research has been done on this, but where as an economic development tool, you're bringing an industry in, or you're expanding an industry that needs a very specialized training. And so clean rooms in the semiconductor industry, for example. And there is a shortage of Arizona citizens, residents that can supply that expert knowledge. And so they're going to recruit from another state. So we'll say, hold on, let's see what we can do with the Arizona population now. And the community colleges have worked out very well. Community colleges are kind of a mixed bag, in my opinion. They do a lot of things not so well. But one thing they do well is these certification programs that are very specific when they are working with exactly what you need to, all the bells you need to hit for these Arizona people that are looking for an advancement. And these are often very high-paying jobs. To wear those suits and work in those clean rooms is just an example I'm aware of where a small rural community college was able to step up and make this happen better than some of the urban ones were. They were very competitive in that front.
I'd love to just add to that. One of the things that actually surprised me quite a bit, to be frank, when I left the private sector was, you know, we're here talking about is higher ed obsolete? And as I've gone down this path, I've recognized how much just of a sclerotic system that higher ed can be. But one of the things that encourages me is that actually the pockets of innovation that also exist in certain places, and probably because there's a tremendous amount of need, and I definitely would not say it's all community colleges, but some of the most interesting and responsive to demand signals programs and institutions I've seen in recent years are actually community colleges. Now, the shame of that is they're also frequently serving the more vulnerable populations in our communities. So when the pandemic hit, we saw double-digit declines in enrollment in community colleges. They got hit the hardest. We also are dealing with, as we all know, a demographic cliff starting in 2025. In fact, college enrollment peaked in 2010. All of this is to say, like, as we're starting to think about what's the future of higher ed, I think a reckoning is coming for some sooner than for others. But when it works well, it is because that connection between demand and supply is tighter, is clearer. There are very clean relationships that where the employment side, where the demand side is really clear in communicating its needs to sources of supply, whether that be the community college system or another one. The problem is that in so many cases, that connection just doesn't exist. Those signals are badly, badly broken. So just wanted to share that. Oh,
That's yours.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, I think it's time that we can open it up for questions. Yeah, I saw your hand first, so I'll walk this back to you.
Thank you. Hi there. Thanks for this panel. So I'm Mariana Davidovich. I work for the Foundation for Economic Education, and what I'm looking for are bottom-up solutions, which you just touched upon very nicely. Are any of you familiar with the college and career academies in the state of Georgia? So my question is, why do people not know about this? Since the year 2000, there's been an incredible partnership that was started in Georgia, just south of Atlanta. There was a partnership between the Technical College System of Georgia, the junior colleges, the school district, and the local industry. And because there was a demand and they weren't able to get enough people, what happened was this partnership formed, and local industry actually came in and started teaching classes in high schools. So they developed something called the College and Career Academy, which is not a school, and it functions similar to like a state charter, but it's not a charter school. It's run by an executive director or CEO. And what happens is all the schools in the surrounding area come in once or twice or even 5 days a week, and it's an opt-in program for all of these schools. And if there's space available, they also let private schools and they also let homeschoolers come in. But really who they're serving are primarily the public school system in the area. They come in and they're the school that, the first one that was formed has 20 vocational pathways. And these kids now, they can start in 8th grade taking classes that are interesting to them in lieu of going to a 4-year university. and there's no additional cost. And it's a win-win situation for local industry. They get the kids and they start apprenticeship programs, mentorship programs. They go straight in. And Preston, I think you said they get paid pretty well. They come out of high school getting 60 or 70 or 80 grand a year. So this has been such an incredible program. And we're headquartered in Atlanta, so I just assumed people knew about it. So my question is, what can we do to let more people know about this and kind of bring this to other states? Because it's just, it seems like such a brilliant solution.
So actually, I had heard of it before, and it's interesting to point out how I heard about it, because we have, I just mentioned the successes of the community colleges. We also have, the universities have their polytechnic schools where they're trying to deal in that space. And then we have what are called joint technological education districts, which was really, they're success stories, but they created another layer of government on top of school districts. And then the school districts that participate in that joint technological education district, which got renamed to Career and Technical Education, CTED, so JTED became CTED. There are successes, but there are also, is that the right way to do it? And so in that conversation about, are we doing this right? And there were a lot of problems. There were audits that came out badly. And in part of my career, I was trying to bird dog those and point to all the flaws. And then Georgia became the example of maybe that's what we should have looked at.
We have 56. I forgot to mention, there are now, since the year 2000, there are 56 college and career academies throughout the entire state, and it works in rural as well as in urban areas. It's just a partnership.
It's
Maybe
interesting.
there is another
We were
layer,
taking a look.
but I'm happy to connect you.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for being here. Chris Hayes, Leadership Institute. So I've heard the academy described as like a Ponzi scheme where doctors just make more doctors, and then you have to make more colleges so that the new doctors can have somewhere to work, because otherwise they'd all be at the same place where there's already the doctor who made them. So Ponzi schemes don't work. We know that. If I had a company and 30% of my employees weren't doing anything, I would shrink it by 30%. And so these are just market truisms that do describe the academy. So first of all, why isn't it shrinking? Why are there more colleges and universities? And then second, how and what does it look like to just get rid of 30% of them? That's what I really want to do. I just want to get rid of 30% of the colleges. Everybody would be better off. So what would that look like?
I can take that one. Yeah. Well, college enrollment has been shrinking since 2010. I think you mentioned that, and it is projected to shrink even further. This has coincided with a number of college closures. I think about 700 colleges have closed since 2010. I'm not taking a normative position on that. Those are just the facts. I think what you allude to is the fact that a lot of the programs out there simply do not prepare graduates for jobs. It's something we've been talking about a lot on this panel, and it used to be the case that students were told, just go to college, get as much education as you can, and you'll be fine. And it turns out, that is true some of the time, but it is not always true. And that is especially not true for a lot of the graduate education programs you mentioned, where if you're getting a PhD in English literature, that probably just qualifies you to teach other people to be doctors of English literature. And I do think that we while students are starting to recognize that themselves a little bit, I do think that we do need federal policy to start stepping in and taking a look at some of these programs that we are pouring taxpayer money into, and say, you actually, if you want to continue to be funded by the federal government, you do have to produce results. You do have to show us that your students are going on to jobs which are going to enable them to pay back their loans and earn a decent standard of living. So I do think that that the reckoning that you hope for may be coming, maybe not as fast as you hope, or maybe not with as broad a scope as you hope, but I do think that we are seeing something of a change in higher education, both in students' attitudes and in just the landscape right now. I think we're over time.
Yeah, we have about 1 minute left. I wanted to make sure, that you had a chance.
I'm going to direct this to Preston. I thought a lot of what you said is really provocative, and I've been really interested in it. But there's something that is a little uncomfortable. And the point is, in thinking about elementary and secondary education, there's a big revival in classical education, right? To understand that our young people need to understand and appreciate the good, true, and beautiful, right? And that some of what our educational system has been doing is really kind of putting people into pathways of learning that has almost like crushed their souls. You know, so they may be very competent in STEM, but they can't appreciate what is wonderful. And I'm worried about if you tie Pell Grants on the ability to have a job, are we going to be crushing future poets? You know, and I know that we kind of maybe scoff at that, but that really is an important part of a culture, a society, and at a time where our country is really struggling with freedom, rights, and responsibilities. Understanding what is beautiful, what is good, and what is true, and elevating that in the academy is also something we don't want to lose. How do you make sure that in this push, we're not going to lose that purpose of education?
So I got my bachelor's degree in economics, which was a very kind of hard-nosed financial decision. You know, that program tended to have good outcomes on the earnings front. But when I was in college, when I was an undergraduate, I was also the head of the College Shakespeare Company. And that I thought that, you know, was a very nice creative outlet in addition to, you know, my supply and demand charts that I was drawing on whiteboards. You know, it was also great to have that creative outlet. You know, it helped me form a community. It helped me learn about, you know, the greatest wordsmith in the English canon. And I think that we can do both. You know, I think that we can have classical education, you know, I think that we can have courses where people are learning about Shakespeare and Plato and, you know, all of the, our very rich classical history. I think that we can do that at the same time that we are providing students with education in fields that will enable them to go on into the labor force and get a job. I think that, you know, it's very important to know that, to remember that we shouldn't lose sight of those things, but I also think that, you know, when you do come out of college 4 years later, you should have something to take into the labor market that will enable you to get a job that will enable where you'll be able to pay back your loans. So I think we can do both, and I think all of us in this room should be working on ways to figure out how we can do both.
Great. All right. Thank you, everyone. I think that's our time. Thanks for attending the panel.